Hello, and thanks once again for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm David Percy. Up first, on the satellite imagery, we've got, well, out to the west, a lot of snow shower activity over the southern Bering Sea, and then pretty cloudy skies, lower top clouds with areas of light snow and fog over the northern Bering Sea. And then you can see the next system pushing into the far western Aleutians, actually in toward the Komondorskis, with the main low center associated with that band of clouds in the Sea of Okhotsk. Otherwise, interior Alaska, just a lot of clouds that are moving from southeast to northwest there and getting kind of pulled apart by the mountainous terrain in the Alaska range there, and you see some clearing north of the mountains, then back into the clouds towards Fairbanks on up to the Yukon Flats. Then it looks like some clearing there up over the eastern Brooks Range down into possibly the Kobuk Valley, as well as the Seward Peninsula could see some breaks today and along the southwest coast. And a band of clouds brought rain, light rain, into the Panhandle during the day today with lighter amounts in the north. And then another developing system to the southwest of the Queen Charlotte Islands there. You can see just coming onto the chart there, moving up to the northeast. That'll continue to move up and increase the wind and rain again tomorrow afternoon along the southern Panhandle. And that'll track north and northwest, staying mostly off the coast there, but it'll kick the winds up a little bit, but nothing too terribly strong. Otherwise, on the chart today, low pressure at the surface right over the Alaska Peninsula, about 972 millibars. Up along the Arctic coast, enough gradient there for gusty east and northeast winds with areas of blowing snow, both on the eastern Arctic coast, where winds had gusted as high as 55 miles an hour at Barter Island, Kaktovik earlier today. And gusty winds also on the western Arctic coast there, Point Lay down to Point Hope, Cape Lisburn as well, with some light snow and flurries. And over the Bering Sea, that cold air continues to pour southward, but the winds not as strong as they have been, still pretty gusty through the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island area there, and then picks enough moisture up to produce areas of clouds, light snow, and snow showers down to the Pribilofs and mostly over the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula area. Basically dry today over Kodiak Island, mostly cloudy skies, few isolated showers there, as well as over the southwest mountains, and areas of light rain and snow along the North Gulf Coast. Pretty dry, though, throughout Cook Inlet into the Mananuska-Susitna Valley today, with temperatures in the breezy areas rising into the mid to upper 30s, with periods of light rain along the North Gulf Coast, into the Panhandle with that weak trough extending down to just east of the Queen Charlotte Islands. And then down to the south, you can see the warm front associated with that next system. And then also out to the west, you can see that occluded front just coming onto the map. And for tonight, that kind of swings up into the western Aleutians there. Really not all that strong of a system, so winds won't be much of a factor, but I'll spread some rain and snow from Shimianatu into Kiska Island, but probably won't make it into the Adak-Atka area. And you can see the gradient becoming slacker over the Bering Sea, a lot less lines than there have been there, so winds are going to become light, and snow showers will persist and extend down to the eastern Aleutians, scattered snow showers to the Alaska Peninsula, but accumulations will be negligible. Same thing for the Pribilof Islands. And now low pressure moving up almost into Kuskokwim Bay, almost right over Cape Newenham there, and a trough extending north along the west coast. That'll kick off some scattered snow showers there from the southwest interior up across the lower Yukon River Valley and Delta and Nulato Hills, all the way up to the western Arctic coast, but very light snowfall amounts there. Winds diminish along all of the Arctic coast later tonight and into tomorrow, and pretty light winds over interior Alaska, as well as dry conditions with some clearing. Could be some scattered isolated snow showers along the Alaska range, and weak trough keeps it unsettled along the North Gulf Coast into western Prince William Sound, and precipitation becomes more showery and possibly ending over portions of the Panhandle. That next system down to the southwest, we'll see tomorrow tracks northeastward there a little bit there, and then starts to turn more northerly in the late afternoon and evening hours. That'll begin to increase the rain along the central and south coast late in the day there for the Panhandle. Otherwise, just scattered rain and snow showers over the remainder of the inside waters. A little bit more active trough swings northwestward there, crossing the Gulf of Alaska in toward the Kenai Peninsula and North Gulf Coast. So that'll increase the rain and to a certain extent the winds into the Resurrection Bay area, Seward, western Prince William Sound, looking at rain moderate to possibly briefly heavy, especially around Portage, Whittier areas. And otherwise, it'll be another dry day, a day much like today across Cook Inlet and Manaska-Susitna Valley. Risk of some rain or snow showers along the Alaska Range, Copper River Basin. And a trough will produce some light snow showers from the Yukon Delta across the Seward Peninsula into the Noatak Valley and the northwest coast. And flurries, fog, light winds anywhere along the Arctic coast. Otherwise, the interior, again, basically dry with a fair amount of clearing possible there north of the Alaska Range in the Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, up across the Yukon Flats. Otherwise, out to the west, rain and snow showers is at low slides just to the south of the central Aleutians. And then for the day on Wednesday, that system kicks off to the east, well south of the Alaska Peninsula, and really is no longer a factor, as the next system brings some more snow into the western Aleutians, and still some most cloudy skies with areas of light snow or snow showers anywhere over the Bering Sea. But again, amounts will be light, and light variable winds for the Pribilofs and the eastern Aleutians, even the Alaska Peninsula, winds looking pretty light, Kodiak Island, and really the interior not too bad on the winds, 5 to 15 miles an hour out of the east, basically, and even lighter as you head northeast and north on the North Slope Arctic coast and the Yukon Flats. Then that system tracks north off the southeast coast, bringing some rain with it, lighter amounts over the eastern panhandle, a little bit heavier along the central and north coast, changing to more showery conditions down toward Dixon Entrance, rain and snow. Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, basically a dry day, just a risk of some snow showers over south central Alaska. And looking at the lows tonight, in the lower 30s over the Panhandle inland areas to near 40 out towards Sitka and Port Alexander. Lower 30s for the North Gulf Coast, mid-30s Kodiak Island, 15 to 25 south central Alaska, 0 to 10 for the Copper River Basin and the Kuskokwim Valley, with lows in the 20s for Bristol Bay. Highs tomorrow in the teens for the Copper River Basin, 25 to 30, south central Alaska, upper 30s down toward Homer and Seward, near 40 for Kodiak, and mid-40s over the coastal areas of the Panhandle and to the south, with upper 30s elsewhere, and 25 to 35 for Bristol Bay, and 10 to 23 for the Kuskokwim Valley. Lows 5 below to 10 above for the Kuskokwim Valley on Wednesday morning. About 0 for the Copper River Basin. Teens and 20s south central Alaska. 30s for the Panhandle, Kodiak Island. Highs 10 to 20 for the Kuskokwim Valley and 5 to 15 in the Copper River Basin. 25 to 35 south central Alaska. Lower 40s Kodiak. 30s to lower 40s for the Panhandle. Up to the north, lows tonight staying above 0 there for much of the central interior. Yukon Flats down to a little 0 to 5 below on up toward Arctic Village, as well as the North Slope, right around 0 for the Arctic coast and the Bering Strait. Highs tomorrow about 4 for Savunga and Tin City. Otherwise, 0 to 15 in the interior, single numbers for the North Slope and Arctic coast. Followed by lows a little cooler, down to 5 to 15 below central eastern interior, and milder out toward the west, staying basically above 0, a shade below 0 for the North Slope and the Arctic coast. Highs 5 below in the east to lower 20s around Nome. And out to the southwest, lows 19 for the Pribilofs tonight, otherwise 20s and lower 30s for the Aleutians, in the 20s for the Alaska Peninsula. And the highs for Tuesday afternoon, mid-20s, St. Paul, St. George, lower 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, mid-30s eastern and central Aleutians, as well as Chimianat too. And the lows Wednesday morning about the same, down to around 19 for St. Paul, mid-20s for the central Aleutians, and lower to, or in the 20s for the Alaska Peninsula.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Tuesday morning. Some marginal VFR along the Brooks Range and then up to the eastern Arctic coast. Otherwise, pretty good VFR there for the central and eastern interior, north of the Alaska Range. Southern Alaska, marginal VFR, some IFR there from the southern Kuskokwim Valley down to Togiak Bay, Dillingham, Cape Newenham area. And northern Bering becoming VFR there, St. Lawrence Island into Norton Sound, southern Seward Peninsula, and also some VFR for the central Aleutians. Otherwise, marginal VFR that extends from the Bering Sea there across the Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, and then some areas of IFR for the Panhandle. For Tuesday afternoon, that burns off to mostly VFR for the southeast coast, lingering marginal VFR up toward Chilkoot and White Pass, Lincoln Glacier Bay area. Otherwise, good VFR in the interior, and now that marginal VFR area extending from the Brooks Range into the Kobuk-Koyukuk Valley and along the Porcupine River and Yukon Flats, and then covering the Bering Sea for the most part, some areas of VFR around the Aleutians, and not much in the way of IFR. Auckland and Kilbrook Mountain areas, north of Dillingham, some IFR possible. Otherwise, marginal VFR, Kodiak Island, southern Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound. And for Wednesday morning, now some IFR, a little bit more of it for Bristol Bay into possibly the southern Kuskokwim Valley, westward to around Bethel and Kuskokwim Bay. Otherwise, the western interior, marginal VFR, as well as the Brooks Range and most of the North Slope and Arctic coast as well. Marginal VFR holds over the Kotzebue Sound area eastward across the Kobuk-Koyukuk valleys. But the Tanana Valley up and 40 Mile Country looking pretty good, mostly VFR. And into the afternoon, some IFR showing up, northern Lynn Canal area. Otherwise, marginal VFR all the way down to Dixon Entrance, covering the Gulf of Alaska, southern Alaska, marginal VFR, including Cook Inlet, and that extends out over the central Bering Sea. But from Atka westward, mostly VFR for the Aleutians, and some scattered VFR over the northern Bering Sea, along with scattered areas of IFR. And the north slope to the Arctic coast, Brooks Range, marginal VFR. And again, that extends down into the Yukon Flats and part of the Koyukuk Valley. For passes Anatuvik and Adigan, both occasionally marginal at times throughout the day on Tuesday, and Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR, especially on the eastern entrances of both passes. About the same for Rainy, too. Lowest conditions on the eastern entrance, better to the west. Windy, optimistically VFR, both southern and northern approaches. Isabel, marginal at times, and could be VFR at other times as well. Mentasta going for a VFR day there, and Tanita, occasional marginal VFR, especially east side. Portage, marginal VFR, and Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR holding into the afternoon, possibly evening hours. Freezing levels at the surface, again, north up into southern Susitna Valley, give or take there, across the Copper River Basin, north of the Panhandle. Still south of the Pribilofs, but north of the Aleutians. Icing, not too bad icing-wise. Still some isolated moderate rime icing, say from Lake Iliamna across southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, possibly northern Kodiak Island, and along the North Gulf Coast. But most of that, the bulk of it, kind of remaining offshore through the afternoon hours. But that'll be pulling northwestward late tomorrow and tomorrow night into southern Alaska. And for the jet stream, southerlies about 65 knots at 33,000 feet from the Gulf of Alaska into the eastern North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, the main jet, again, south of the forecast area. 9,000 feet, south winds 50 knots across the eastern Gulf of Alaska, turns east-southeast 40 knots, Kenai Peninsula, south 45 knots there, eastern Norton Sound and the Lotto Hills, and 35 knots in that same area there. Otherwise, 60-knot easterlies there coming up toward the North Gulf Coast areas. As far as turbulence goes, considerable moderate turbulence, Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, light to isolated moderate for eastern Norton Sound and the Bering Strait.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining us again, talking about the augmented reality sandbox, is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. And he's actually talking about a project from AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. A lot of acronyms, but some really fun stuff today, right, Eric?
You bet. We've got a learning tool that is a tool that's fun to use, and it really has a relevance to actually daily lives of anyone who goes outside and sees lumpy topography in Alaska. We've got a lot of mountains and such. You know, when I was younger and go on your first hike in the hills, say, you're given, maybe you're in the Boy Scouts or you get at the kiosk at the trailhead, a topographic map, a flat piece of paper with all these lines on it, bullseyes, long lines that curve back on themselves, say, perhaps things that look like this, a quadrangle or a topographic map. We've got here just to illustrate a couple of examples near Denali. Alaska has so much topography, so many mountains. And what are all these lines that we see? It can be tough to know what this means the first time you look at it. What we've got, all these lines represent lines of where the elevation of the topography goes through a certain level above sea level. Say that this line represents where the mountains have gone from below 1,000 feet, mean sea level, up through 1,000 feet and above. That's your 1,000-foot contour. And when the mountain keeps going up, you're up to 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, and so on. And that's how you get this little bullseye around the peak of a mountain.
Kind of makes layered slices, right?
Kind of like layered slices. Nice way to look at that. And when you see the lines are closer together, you're going up more steeply. If the mountain rises more slowly, it takes you longer in horizontal space to go through those different vertical increments.
That is really hard to visualize.
Right. Imagine you're looking at a 2D piece of paper, two-dimensional piece of paper, but you're trying to understand what the three-dimensional world looks like. Well, enter the augmented reality sandbox. Yes, what is that? It is right here. We have the sandbox with us today, Sandbox 2.0, portable version. Sweet. Built up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we've got a couple of folks helping out today.
Let's see, Alana Valaji, and she's a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you want to give us a thumbs up there, Alana, thanks for helping us out today. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator from AKwx, also helping us out today. Thanks, Courtney.
And this tool here has a Microsoft Kinect to sense the level of sand in this sandbox. And then the Kinect feeds its information into a computer that then sends a signal to a projector to draw the appropriate topographic lines on this topography. The fun thing about this, as we can see here, is that the sandbox and its Kinect and its projector, they all work as a team. So here we've got a mountain in the middle of the sandbox. What if we took down the mountain to some degree? Watch as the software responds and redraws the topography.
Kind of a caldera forming there.
There you go, And what's fun about the sandbox, too, is it knows that gravity flows downhill, and we've got some water that's actually down in the lowest elevations. And what's happening now is we're making it rain a little bit. We'll fill up rain into that elevated lake bed, that caldera, as you said. And so now water is pooled up there. And what if you gouged out an outlet channel?
Glacial dam release.
There you go. The water flows out. What we're seeing here is a tool that allows people to touch and connect Microsoft Connect, RRR, to connect two-dimensional topographic maps like what we have here, these flat things on a piece of paper, to the real three-dimensional world. I think this Sandbox's real particular application as a learning tool to young people is, what does a two-dimensional map mean when it's trying to represent the three-dimensional world? This sandbox is kind of both at once. It's actually three-dimensional, lumpy topography there, the sand, but it's got these lines drawn on the three-dimensional sand that would be on a two-dimensional piece of paper.
Wow, that is a huge leap from the learning that we experienced when we were younger to how children and even adults are visualizing in this new forms of technology. Allows that to kind of reshape their thinking and visualize this in a very useful and absolutely hands-on way. It's amazing.
It's a hands-on tool, and
it's hard for me to sit here and not go play with that.
Well, that's what happened at GINA up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, when the first model was being made, the prototype with plywood and such, we had professional adult professor types had heard about this, and they came by because they wanted to see how it worked.
Okay.
And everyone becomes that idealistic, wonder-filled youngster.
Sure.
And you just can't help but play with that, and to see how it reacts in time, and
Right.
it's a dynamic learning tool, and it responds.
That's exactly the word. Yeah.
And you wonder what applicabilities beyond a teaching tool for
Where does it
topography
go?
can it have? You can see how in Alaska we have inundation mapping is an issue. If you had water slosh inland, say in a coastal flooding event on the western coast of Alaska or the Arctic coast, you could see this. The concept is illustrated here as an introductory learning method. I think this is a potentially good outreach tool for all of us in Alaska.
Okay, so not only just a topographical sense, a mapping sense, maybe something that leads into understanding of how geographic information systems work with GIS, but also geology, if we wanted to get into kind of the formations and the bigger land masses and the representation of the 2D map. We could go into hydrology, which is very important in Alaska, of course, and even just understanding weather sense. Mounding up a big pile of sand could be that Arctic high-pressure system sitting on top of Fairbanks, and the voids would be low-pressure systems. This can go a lot of different directions.
Yes, exactly. Wow. It's not just landforms, but pressure has contours of high pressure and low pressure. And I wish I had this kind of a learning tool when I was taking Meteorology 101 back 25 years ago.
Wow.
Would have been helpful, I think.
Probably would have gotten a better grade, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming by, Eric, and Alana and Courtney, thank you so much for your help there in the sandbox. We are going to play in the sandbox a little bit more coming up tomorrow on our next edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We hope you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you go to alaska.edu/EPSCOR. That's alaska.edu EPSCOR to learn more information about what we're doing with this augmented reality sandbox around Alaska. We'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to the marine forecast, gale warnings along the southeast coast for the day Tuesday. On the south coast from the southeast, 35 to 40 knots. The north coast, east-southeast winds, 35 knots. Light winds for Lynn Canal, southeast at about 15 knots with seas at 4 feet. But small craft advisories for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait for winds southeast at 25 knots with possible gusts to 40 knots. And for the day Wednesday, north winds 25 knots for Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage with 5-foot seas. Clarence Strait southeast at 25 knots. And gale warnings continue on the south coast of the Panhandle from the south at 35 knots. Central coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the north coast, east winds at 20 knots. Prince William Sound for Tuesday, looking at east winds at 20 knots, seas around 4 feet, but gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, where winds will be out of the east at 35 knots, and the Barren Islands, east winds at 30 knots. Kamishak Bay, east winds 25 knots. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 knots with 3 to 7 foot seas. For Wednesday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots, and Kamishak Bay, southeast at 25. Barren Islands looking at south winds at 25 knots with 14-foot seas. In the North Gulf Coast, winds will be south at 25 knots. Prince William Sound, winds mostly out of the southeast at 25 knots. Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 5 to 10 feet. Light variable winds for Bristol Bay with seas down to 3 feet. And the Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest winds 15 to 20 knots with seas running 6 to 9 feet. And for Wednesday, light variable winds in the forecast for the Alaska Peninsula, really laying down pretty good there with seas around 3 to 7 feet. Bristol Bay, light west winds at 10 knots, and Kodiak Island, winds will be south at 20 knots with 5 to 10 foot seas. And for the eastern Aleutians on Tuesday, west-northwest winds 20 knots. Variable to south winds at 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians. Variable winds at 20 knots for the western Aleutians. And moving on to the day Wednesday, from Shemia to Kiska, east winds at 20 knots for Amchitka Island, small craft advisory. Southwest winds 25 knots. Central Aleutians west-southwest 15 to 25 knots. And the eastern Aleutians, variable to northwest winds at 10 to 15 knots with 5 to 9 foot seas. For the Pribilof Islands on Tuesday, winds will be northwest at 10. St. Matthew Island, winds north at 20 knots. For the southwest coast, north to northwest winds at 15 knots. And for the St. Lawrence Island area, winds will be north at 25 knots and Norton Sound northeast at 15. For the day Wednesday, brisk wind advisories for Norton Sound for northeast winds 25 knots. St. Lawrence Island north at 25. Variable winds at 10 knots for the Yukon Delta coast. South of Nunivak Island, they'll be out of the west at 10 knots. Pribilof Islands, variable winds 10 knots, seas 5 feet, and north winds at 20 knots for St. Matthew Island. Central and eastern Beaufort Sea Coast Tuesday, brisk wind advisories, winds out of the east at 25 knots, east 20 knots for the western Arctic coast, and the Chukchi Sea, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Wednesday, Chukchi Sea, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, brisk wind advisories on the western Arctic coast, east winds 25 there, and for the central and eastern Arctic coast, winds mostly out of the east or northeast at about 20 knots. And looking at tonight again, pretty dry over interior Alaska with light wind conditions and diminishing winds over the Bering Sea with areas of light snow and snow showers from the Pribilofs down to the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Some rain and snow shower activity for the Kodiak Island area and about the same for the North Gulf Coast, and becoming a little more showery as far as the precipitation goes for the Panhandle. Next front pushing some rain and snow or snow into the western Aleutians. And for tomorrow, that system kind of slides off to the southeast there, brings some rain and snow in toward Adak and Atka. Winds becoming light over just about all of the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Another trough will spread some more moisture, especially into the western North Gulf Coast, southern Kenai Peninsula. Another front will result in the same thing for the southern Panhandle. That low will track north and northwest and weaken off the coast of the Panhandle for some gusty winds, especially on the north coast, and a chance of rain or rain and snow mix for the North Gulf Coast, dry over the interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.